So look, last time we had a bit of a podcast and we were talking about the CGT consequences of granny flat arrangements. And since that podcast, we've got a whole heap of feedback from clients and people interested in what the actual terms of a granny flat agreement are. But just touching on it again, what is a granny flat agreement?
Yeah, sure. So a granny flat agreement is just a formally written agreement that gives a person who's of pension age or a person with a disability with the right to live in a property for life.
Okay, so let's just take a scenario. We've got Bob and his son Simon, and they've agreed that Bob can build a flat onto Simon's house. Bob's going to pay the builder direct. It's going to cost about $600,000. What are some of the terms that you'd have in that agreement between Bob and Simon?
Yeah, so some of the important details you would need is the parties involved, when are the circumstances when the agreement can be varied or terminated, and what happens if the agreement is varied or terminated.
Okay, so termination. What about the electricity bill that Simon's going to get? No doubt some of that's being used by Bob. Is that something you put in the agreement, who pays what?
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely one of the things you would have is household costs, who's going to pay for those sorts of expenses, and Bob can contribute to those expenses because they're unlikely to be commercial in nature. They're just reimbursing for costs.
So I suppose it's going to be really important to make sure about repairs and maintenance to the flat and the whole house. That I suppose needs to be detailed. What about charging rent?
So you wouldn't charge rent. Well, in our case, Bob has paid $600,000 to live in the home anyway, so there's no rent in our scenario. And you also, rent is likely considered commercial in nature. So the CGT exemption wouldn't apply to that.
So if we're having a granny flat agreement where there's not going to be any CGT consequences, we have to make sure it's not commercial in nature, don't we? So
yeah. It
can't be just like a residential tenancies lease. It's got to be a granny flat arrangement where Bob's paid you $600,000, so he doesn't need to pay rent as well. You mentioned termination before, so inevitably as you get older, I suppose, Bob was mobile and he had his marbles, but 10 years down the track, if he needs to go into aged care, I suppose we need to detail that in the agreement?
Yeah, that's one of the things you could definitely detail is what happens if he needs to leave the property. Is it going to get terminated, and will Bob get any of his money back, and how much will he get back as well?
So I suppose if you put $600,000 in, I suppose the market value of the flat might be much higher. It might be difficult to work out the difference between Simon's part of the house and the flat, I suppose. Maybe you need a formula over the whole property about what sort of money that Bob would get back, because no doubt the costs of going into aged care are going to increase over time too. What about that scenario where Simon goes through a divorce, I guess? What happens then?
Yeah, that's something else you'd need to consider when drafting the agreement, is what happens if there is a divorce or someone gets a partner or goes bankrupt or passes away. They're all different types of circumstances you need to consider. And yeah, potentially he gets some sort of interest in it.
Yeah. So I suppose we're recognising the right that even though the title might stay in Simon's name, Bob's going to have an interest in the property. So if it's the total value of the property is $1.5 million after the flat's being built, well, really the before value was say $900,000. With the flat, it's $1.5 million. So effectively, Bob's got what are we going to say, 6/15 interest in the property as a total. So what goes into the asset pool will be the difference. It'll be just Simon's 9/15 of the property. You mentioned partners. What happens if Bob gets a new partner? I suppose that's something we should put in the agreement as well, whether that partner can live there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's something else you'd need to consider in the agreement.
And I suppose a pet as well would be another thing, whether that's allowed or not.
Yeah.
And I suppose the big one would be, can Bob wander into Simon's house?
Yeah, that's another big thing is, where can he access on the property?
And quite often in these arrangements, because it's been family, I think it's worthwhile detailing whether they're going to have meals together or putting a limit on the number of meals together. I I'm sure that's sort of a much more informal arrangement, but perhaps there needs to be some minimum and maximum, because I imagine it'd be quite difficult in the family arrangement if Bob is hanging around there all the time.
Yeah.
So look, there's a lot of granny flat agreement, I guess, and each one of them is going to be sort of tailored to the particular circumstances, isn't it? But termination and that value is obviously a big thing, and protecting, Bob's going to want the protection and Simon's going to need protection, and we've got to think about third parties, wives and things as well, and I suppose new partners.
Yeah.
And pets.
And anything you can use the property for, like can you assign it, sublet it, can you make changes to the property? All those things would need to be considered.
Okay. So look, simple idea becomes quite complex. I'm happy to assist. We've been drafting a number of these recently, particularly since the CGT exemption came in just late last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was about last year.
Thanks very much.